My name is Shirley Brazo. I'm the Associate Director of the Multicultural Education and Resource Center, and I'm also an Adjunct Assistant Professor with the Center for Native American Studies. Today we're going to be joining a session with Ms. Susan Vercloth. This is Risk and Resiliency, Unpacking the Disproportionate Representation of American Indian, Alaska Native Students in Special Ed Programs and Services. And that's our 50-cent title today. We just want to remind everybody to please silence your cell phones and to fill out an evaluation form when we're done so that we can keep track of all the wonderful things that people are here to share with us today. Today's session is presented by Dr. Susan Vercloth. She's the co-director of the Center for the Study of Leadership in American Indian Education. Dr. Vercloth joined the faculty of the Pennsylvania State University in the fall of 2003. She's currently an assistant professor of educational leadership, having recently completed a 3-year joint appointment in special education. She earned both her master's and doctoral degrees from Penn State, where she was a fellow in the American Indian Special Education Teacher Training Program and the American Indian Leadership Program. After earning her doctoral degree, she served as the Director of Policy Analysis and Research with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. Dr. Vercloth's research focuses on the education of American Indian and Alaska Native students with disabilities. She's specifically interested in the factors that account for the referral and placement of American Indian Alaska Native students in special ed programs and services in the early grades.
You can stop it.
Okay. And with that, I guess Ms. Susan will take it away. Okay.
Can you all hear me if I stand down? Can you hear me? Or do you need the microphone? I just feel more comfortable not in front of the microphone. And I asked her not to read my whole bio because I realize as you read it, it gets kind of boring. It puts me to sleep. And also because I like to tell stories about how I got into working with special ed. That's going to force me to conform to the microphone. Can you hear me now? Okay. Try not to yell. So I wanted to tell a little bit about myself and why I work in special ed. And then I also wanted to make this more of a conversation. And so I'm kind of disjointed because there's a few people on this side, and so I'm going to go back and forth. But I wanted to make this more of a conversation to talk about some of the factors that I've found that account for so many Native children being in special ed programs and services. But as I said, I also wanted to make it more of a conversation. So I have some data, I have some information, but at any time you have questions or thoughts, then feel free to just stop me. I've taught special ed, and I often act in a very disjointed way, so I don't have much of a problem of getting misdirected and redirected. And if any of you know Marty Reinhardt, we went to school together, and so I'm waiting for Marty to distract me at any minute. So I'm already prepared for that. But I wanted to start out by just giving a little bit of information about me, and then I'll explain the picture. And I'm having some technical difficulties, so I'll flash back and forth and hope that we can get this to work. But I was introduced to Susan Vercloth. I am an assistant professor of educational leadership at Penn State. Last year I came for this conference from UCLA. I came, spent a wonderful snowy 2 days, and never got to present anything, but then went back to LA. And I spent the year at UCLA working with the Civil Rights Project, which had just moved to UCLA from Harvard. And the reason that I was there is that I've done quite a bit of work looking at why Native students are placed in special ed programs and services, but there's not a lot of literature that talks about special ed from a civil rights perspective. And so in my opinion, when you look at how many of our students are being placed in special ed, it has real implications for our students' attainment of civil rights across the lifespan. It has implications for their attainment of social capital, cultural capital, and economic capital. And I finally found some data as I was getting ready for this trip, and it's from the state of Michigan, which backs up what I've been saying. And there's an annual report from the state that talks about their progress on No Child Left Behind, and there's indicators related back to special ed. And the state has pointed out specifically that there are some outcomes, some unintended outcomes of inappropriate placement or inappropriate referral and assessment. And the state of Michigan talks specifically about unintended outcomes in terms of education and unintended outcomes in terms of economics. And I think that's very important information. And so when we talk about this disproportionate representation, I'm not talking about just too many of our students going into special ed, but I'm also talking about not enough of our children being identified as being gifted, or too many of our students being identified for special ed but being placed in the wrong categories. And so we need to talk about assessment as being a really important part of this process. So how did I get into this? This is what I wanted to tell about my background. My undergraduate degree is in Latin American history, and I wanted to be an FBI agent. And it wasn't working out. So I had this Latin American history degree, and I went home. I'm from North Carolina, if you can hear by my accent. And I'm tired, so it gets worse when I'm tired. So think about it when I'm not quite as tired. So I had this degree in Latin American history, and I went home, and I didn't have a job. And my parents told me, we love you dearly, but you really need to get a job. And so my parents said, we'll send you back to school, and you can get, I had a history degree, Latin American history. We'll help you get a teaching degree so you can teach history. And I had no desire whatsoever to do anything that was related to education. And I fought it kicking and screaming that I would not be a teacher, that I would not do anything that had to do with schooling. And so I fought that for a couple of months until my parents continued to tell me how much they loved me, but I really needed to get a job. And so I ended up working in a variety of things. And my second year out of college, I worked with it was Title IX at that time, a Title IX Indian Ed program. And I worked in 13 different junior high and middle schools in a large urban school district in North Carolina. And I realized very quickly that I don't do well with students who are in middle school and junior high school. There's too many hormones, too many emotions, too many things going on. And so I learned that very quickly, what I don't do well. So I did that, and then a job announcement came for working at a community college with a student support services program. And so I worked with first-generation, low-income, minority students. And at that time, we were just passing the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we were getting more and more students with disabilities coming into colleges, and particularly community colleges. And this community college in rural North Carolina was really afraid that they were going to get students coming in and not be able to serve those students. And they were going to be in trouble because of the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we got in a student from the North Carolina School for the Deaf, and our closest interpreter was an hour and a half away each way. And if that interpreter wasn't there, we didn't have anybody to work with this student. And so my administration came to me and asked me if I wanted to work with this student and work with students with disabilities. So armed with this Latin American history degree, I became the coordinator of disability services, because that really arms you well to work with disabilities. And so, and my FBI skills did come into play when I would sneak around and see what the interpreter was doing when he was getting paid but sleeping in his car and all these other kinds of things. So I did that, and I realized that I had a real love for working with students with disabilities. And so I did that for a couple of years, and then an announcement came across my desk for a master's degree at Penn State in special education. And it was the American Indian Special Ed Teacher Training Program. And I had fought so hard against being a teacher. I applied for the program, was accepted, but there was no money left. And 2 weeks before school started, I got a call saying, we found the money. Do you want to come work on your master's degree? And so I quit my job, moved to Pennsylvania, and earned a master's degree in special ed. And I thought, if I didn't do well with junior high, then high school is the place I need to be. And so, because that's just logical, if you can't work with junior high, middle school students, then you ought to be a high school teacher. And so I had a real love for working with challenging students, particularly students who had emotional and behavioral disorders. And because I like to get yelled at, kicked at, screamed at, cursed at, that kind of thing. And so I taught high school special ed in North Carolina. And one of the classes that I taught was a class of 8 16-year-old guys, all with emotional and behavioral disorders, in an English class. And so you try teaching Romeo and Juliet to 16-year-olds who have emotional and behavioral disorders, who don't want to be there in the first place. And you try to make it exciting for them. And in addition to these emotional behavioral disorders, they have learning disabilities. And what I found is one-on-one, they were big babies. If you could find that thing that could really get those students interested in what you're doing, together they're hell on wheels. And there were times when I thought I was in the wrong place. And there were times, one occasion in particular, that I left my classroom, and I told my supervisor that I couldn't handle being in that classroom because I was supposed to be teaching my students how to act appropriately, and I didn't feel like acting appropriately. And so how could they learn appropriate behavior when I'm feeling like I'm out of control? And so that really got me to thinking about what's the support system that's in place for teachers, particularly beginning teachers who are placed in a special ed classroom without the necessary supports and training that they need. And I remember that first step going into that special ed classroom. This was before the students came. And I tell this story quite often. If I've ever thought I looked pretty in my life, I thought I looked pretty that day. I had on this black and red skirt. It was polka dot and my black heels. And I went, and I didn't have any furniture in my classroom. I didn't have any books, and the room was dirty. And I'm thinking, what have I gotten myself into? And I remember having occasions when students were out of control, and I thought, who can I go to who knows more than I know about this process? And so that led me to think about what do I want to do with my career after this. So I applied for a job working with college students, again, with disabilities. And in that process, I asked for a reference from Penn State, and Penn State said, why don't you apply for your doctoral degree and come back and work on a doctoral degree in educational leadership? And so 3 weeks before school started that time, I got a call, I was accepted, and I went to Penn State. And I thought, I know the special ed piece, but I don't know the leadership, the administrative piece. And so I earned a doctoral degree in educational administration with a focus on special ed. And as a part, that's how I met Marty. We were there. We worked on our doctoral degrees at the same time. And so what I did in that was I surveyed, because my focus was on American Indian students. I'm from a small tribe in North Carolina. And what I was realizing is that there's this over-representation of Native students in special ed, and there's this under-representation of Native teachers. That was part of the focus at Penn State of having a program to train and then send out Native teachers, is because our feeling was that if you've got all these Native children being referred and placed in special ed, they need to have people who look like them, who understand them, who come from their communities, and who are committed to working with them. And so when I went back for my doctoral degree, I thought, I know this special ed piece, but I don't know the administrative piece. And so I combined the two, and I surveyed 600 schools across the nation that had 50% or more American Indian Alaska Native students, and 300 of those schools responded back. And I asked the principals, what is it that you know and don't know about special ed? Now, there's a problem there. Anytime you ask somebody what they know, they always think they know more than they do, or they're going to tell you that they know more than they do. But the number one thing that they told me that they knew but needed to know more about was law. And my theory about that was that principals don't want to get sued. And so they see special ed, and if anybody disagrees with me on this, I mean, you can feel free to argue with me, but principals don't want to be sued. And so we have this real litigious kind of environment where administrators are doing everything they can not to be sued. And that's not necessarily what's in the best interest of a student. So over the last few years, I've been working in that area, looking at what's in the best interest of our students. I graduated with my doctoral degree in 2000 with this educational leadership special ed, but I didn't feel like I was ready to go back and be a faculty member. And so there are two places that I've said I would never live in my life. One was Washington, D.C., and the other one was Los Angeles. And I ended up being in both of those places. And I went to work with the American Indian Higher Ed Consortium, where I worked with the tribal colleges as their director of research and policy analysis, and really got to learn from the ground up what's going on in tribal communities and tribal colleges and the policy piece. But there was something missing, and that was my real love and my passion for working with students with disabilities or students receiving special ed services. And I remember back to when I was deciding my dissertation topic, and the chair of our program said to me, what are you going to do your dissertation on? And I told him, and he said, that's not a sexy topic. And I remember thinking, a sexy dissertation topic, I don't quite get that. But I can honestly say, and I say this over and over again, I started working on that research in 1998, so it's been almost 10 years. And almost every morning that I wake up, I can't think of anything sexier to do as a career or a profession than to look at what's going on with our Native children and to try to understand why so many of them are going into special ed. And so that's what I do. And I do a lot of work with parents and teachers. I do parent training because I think parents are often left out of this process and not understanding that if you really understand the special ed law, it's weighted heavily in favor of parents and families. The problem is parents and families don't often understand that the law is weighted heavily in their favor. And so we have this situation where schools are telling parents and families, this is what you must do. Without parents and families understanding, I have the right to contest that. I have an obligation to ask questions. I have an obligation to make sure that the school does what's in the best interest of my child. And over the last couple of years, as I ponder these questions of why so many of our students are in special ed, I realized that I've really missed the mark if I wait to look at our children once they enter school, and that we really need to be paying attention to what's happening to our children in the early childhood years before they enter school. Because if we wait until they enter school, our children already enter school placed at risk in many cases for special ed. And so we need to be thinking about how do we get our children ready for school, but there's another piece of that, how do we get our schools ready for our children? And we need to have them be healthy environments, welcoming environments that understand and respect and pay attention to our children's language and their culture and all these other things that impact our children. The other thing that's motivated me, and I put a picture up here. I don't have any children. I have a dog who I think is pretty special, but I have a niece, and her name is Kanani. She lives in Hawaii. And so she's the daughter of my sister. My sister is adopted. My sister is Mexican-American, American Indian. She's married to an Asian Pacific Islander. And so Kanani's Asian Pacific Islander, Hawaiian, American Indian, Mexican. You know, it's really confusing. And when my family goes to Hawaii, they say, when we see you guys, we think you're one of us. When you talk, we don't know what you are. So it's all. And Kanani was in North Carolina. Both my sister and her husband are both in the military. One deployed to Iraq. The other one's been deployed to the Philippines and Thailand and is now back. So Kanani, who's 3, spent 6 months in North Carolina with my parents. So now she's a Southern-speaking Hawaiian, which is really confusing. But her name is Kanani in Hawaiian, and that means beautiful little one. And so over the last 2 years as I've done this work in early childhood, and I struggle a lot in my life thinking about what do I do and what do I want to do when I grow up, and why do I do what I do. And I was thinking back to her name, which Kanani means beautiful little one. And so I really am trying to do my work in a way that it reflects upon what's in the best interest of not just this beautiful little one, but all those beautiful little ones. What is it that we can do to ensure that they get the most appropriate services that they need? And that may mean that special ed is the most appropriate service for that child. And as a special ed teacher, I think special ed is great, and I'm not sure why all students don't get special ed. Because special ed is individualized instruction that emphasizes our children's unique individual strengths as well as their weaknesses. But when special ed is done wrong, and when it's done poorly, and when a child is placed in special ed, as I said before, it can have some very negative lifelong implications for those students. Or when they don't receive those services, it has negative lifelong implications. And so we want to think about why is it that they're being referred and placed, and what is it that we can do to ensure that they're getting the most appropriate services. One of the things that I'm getting some heat from my colleagues about is I talk about children being placed in special ed, and the law says that special ed is not a place. It's not a physical place. And what I've been arguing is it's not. Legally, it's not a place. It's a service, and that service can be provided anywhere. But if you go into our school, special ed is a place. And I've been in that place, and it's not always a happy place or a positive place. And so we need to be thinking about it, in my opinion, in a different way so that we ensure that it's not a place, that it's a service, and it's a service that can be provided in a regular ed classroom, and it's not a lifelong sentence. That the goal of special ed is not to identify a student and have that student in special ed from kindergarten through 12th grade, but it is to get them in, get them the services that they need in order to be successful in the regular classroom environment. unless it's a student with a very severe disability who will always require special services. And there are children who will require those services. So just having this different mindset. So I show you this picture. The other reason I show you this picture is, the title of my presentation, I don't know what I was thinking about when I came up with the title. But when you think about the risk and resiliency piece, this picture to me demonstrates the very things that place our children at risk, but the things that also can help our children to be resilient. And this is a picture of Kanani at my parents' house at Christmas, and you can see, I think she was 2 here, and so she's laying back and she has a book in her hand, but she has a picture of fancy dancers in the back. Because language and culture, I'm from a southern tribe, and we lost our language, but we really strive so that our children can understand who they are culturally, and that's very difficult when you don't have your language. But we strive to make sure that we know who we are culturally. At the same time, in our family, we're striving to make sure that Kanani understands that to be a Native person doesn't mean that you can't be an academic achiever, that you can't have high academic standards. And I think that that's the thing that's placing many of our children at risk, is that schools are not viewing our children's language and culture as a strength, but they're viewing it as something that places our children at risk. You speak that language. You don't speak English correctly, and so you must not be as smart or as able as your peers. And part of that goes back to the assessment process. How do we make sure that assessment captures our students' strengths as well as the things that they're weak at or things they need to improve on? And then I'll show you one more picture. So we have another one of Kanani. Again, I think it demonstrates that if you go back, and we have kind of this photographic history of our family, and it's interesting, all the pictures that I pull of her, there seems to be something, not all of them. I got one last night where she and her mom have girls' night out, and they went to Chili's, and she took her dog, Shirley, and her mom said it was funny until people realized Shirley's not real, and so they were kind of looking around trying to see where Shirley is. So there are pictures that don't have the cultural academic piece, but they have the family piece. And so that's another piece that's missing from this whole special ed puzzle. Here, she's at a powwow in Hawaii. What does she have? She has her book. She also has her jingle dress on. She also has Dora shoes on because she loves Dora and Diego. So again, showing that even in the midst of this powwow, there's culture and there's language and there's academics, there's reading. And so how those things can be meshed together. And if anybody has any questions so far, any points, feel free to stop me. And Marty, I may need your help to get back. Okay, we're good. Is that the one? Okay. So I'll get into the presentation. So we have some selected demographics. And these are not specific to the state of Michigan, but just to give you an idea of what's going on in our schools. So the 2000 census tells us that American Indians, Alaska Natives represent less than 1% of the total population. We know there are more than 565 federally recognized tribes. And I do have some copies of the presentation up front. If there are not enough copies, I have business cards. You can email me, and I'll be happy to send a copy after the presentation. We know that there are more than 565 federally recognized tribes, approximately 70 state-recognized tribes, and more than 200 different languages that are still spoken. And I think those demographics are important because they tell us how diverse the Native population is and how diverse our school-age population is. There are approximately 47.2 million students in the U.S. Out of those, almost 6 million receive special ed services. Nearly 2% of all students in special ed are American Indian, Alaska Native. And then specifically for the state of Michigan, we know that we have approximately 1.7 million students during the 2005-2006 school year, about 16,000 American Indian students in Michigan, less than 1% of the student population. Now, when I give you these figures about the 2%, again, I get a lot of questions because when we think about overrepresentation is defined as when you look at what your percentage of students in the general population is and what that percentage looks like in special ed. And if that population in special ed is significantly higher or significantly lower than it is in the general population, you have an issue of overrepresentation or disproportionate representation. The state of Michigan uses risk ratios, and they look at things like 2.5 times the percentage of other students. So if American Indians were placed in special ed at a rate 2.5 times that of African Americans or whites, and generally it's white students being the referent group, the one you're comparing to, then you have an issue of overrepresentation. That's important. You can get all of this from the Michigan Department of Ed's website. It's important because once you start to exceed those risk ratios or those percentages in special ed start to exceed or go under what the students' percentages are in the general population, then you start getting in trouble in terms of AYP, No Child Left Behind reporting, in terms of reporting for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. Because what IDEA, the special ed law, requires is that every year states break out by race, by ethnicity, by gender, how many students are being placed in special ed or how many are receiving special ed services. And then what happens is if those numbers look bad or wrong or troubling, then the state is under heat to come up with a plan. There are 2 states now in particular that I've worked with. Wisconsin and Minnesota are both states that have been cited by the federal government as having overrepresentation of African American and American Indian students in special ed, particularly in the emotional behavioral category. And so once you start being flagged, then the state is required to come up with a plan. Again, if you go to Michigan's Department of Ed in their Special Ed and Early Intervention Services website, and there's a link on the presentation that I'll give you, the handout, it will tell you that the state of Michigan has identified a number of ways in which districts can address this issue of overrepresentation or underrepresentation. 2 of the things that they've specifically talked about is making sure that assessment is appropriate and making sure that parents and families are involved in the process. And so I think those are 2 areas, if you're looking for strategies, how you can address this overrepresentation issue, is to get parents more actively involved and also to make sure that assessment is fair, it's appropriate, it's non-discriminatory. How you do that is a whole other ball of wax because there are so few assessment instruments that include Native students in their norming groups. And what the state will tell you and a district will tell you is it's too expensive to come up with a whole new instrument that is normed on this population. But there are other things you can do, like simply sitting down. And I'll give you an example. In the state of Minnesota, I was asked to come in and work with the school district on assessment. And what I said to them is, I'll come in, but I'm not an assessment expert. I'll come in and I'll talk to you, but I won't do it unless you open up this session to parents, families, and teachers. Because I feel like parents often feel like teachers have some secret handshake that parents aren't privy to. And that teachers are talking, and I sound like I'm talking badly about teachers. I don't think that the blame for overrepresentation lies solely on teachers or school psychologists or administrators. I think it's a partnership. And I think there's some blame that needs to be placed in a variety of different ways. But what I said to them is we need to have a conversation that involves parents and families and educators in the room together so that they can talk to each other. And, one of the things that's important about assessment is relationship building. And if you look at Minnesota, they have a handbook on their Minnesota Department of Public Ed website, and it's called Reducing Bias in Special Ed Assessment, and I can't remember the rest of the title. And one of the things they have in there is a questionnaire, a parent and family questionnaire, and so you go into a family and you're asking them questions. What I said to them is, I don't know about communities in Minnesota, but if you come to my small rural community in North Carolina and I don't know you and you start asking me questions about how much money I make, who lives in my house, all these things, I'm not going to tell you the truth because I'm going to think that there's something negative attached to that. And so I'm not going to be very open. But if I know you and you come in, then I'll be much more forthcoming with you about this information. And so it goes back to building relationships. The problem is with special ed, you have all of these timelines, 30 days between the time that you ask for this and when it happens, 45 days. Can you build a relationship in 30 days? Can you build a relationship in 45 days? Not a very stable relationship, but you can get parents and families to understand that you care about their child and that you're interested in their best interest, and you plant the seeds. And so, again, I think assessment's important, but I think even going back before that, looking at the relational piece of it. How do you interact with these families? Do they understand that you're authentic, that you're real, that you're committed to working with them? You know, you can also work through Title VII programs or Title IX or whatever title it happens to be that year, your Indian Ed program. If there's homeschool liaisons, need to be a part of that special ed process. They know the families. They know the communities. They can go in and help to create a relationship. So I think that's very important. Then some of the other issues and concerns. So I've given you just a broad overview of what special ed looks like. What I missed out of that broad overview before I go to the issues and concerns is that there are 13 different categories that the federal government identifies that a student can be eligible for special ed under. And I'll go through some of those categories. There are 13 different categories, and there are 4 that account for somewhere between 89 and 90% of all students being placed. So you have specific learning disabilities. A child has a learning disability in reading, math, writing, or another area. A child can be diagnosed as mentally retarded. A child can be diagnosed as having a speech or language impairment. A child can be diagnosed as having an emotional or behavioral disturbance. That's 4 out of the 13 categories where approximately 89 to 90% of all students are placed and receive services. The number 1 category is specific learning disability. About 50% of all students, regardless of their race or ethnicity, are identified and receive services under the category of specific learning disability. The issue there is that the federal governments have recently redefined the way in which we identify a child as having a specific learning disability. And now they're using something called response to intervention. Are you all familiar with that process? And it's about as clear as a mud puddle is on a rainy day, because we're just beginning to implement this whole response to intervention as being a way of identifying whether or not a child has a learning disability. The reason for that is in the past, you could be in the state of Mississippi and not have a learning disability, come to Michigan and have a learning disability, because the way in which they defined a discrepancy between your ability to learn and your achievement varied depending on where you were. You also see an increasing number of children who in the past would have been identified as having a mild or moderate mental retardation, now being identified in the learning disability category. An issue of concern for American Indians and Alaska Natives is the category of speech and language impairment. I'm working with a Head Start program, and I'll just say it's a Head Start program, a tribal Head Start program in the Northeast, where they have 2 different settings, 2 different Head Start programs. And in one program, they have 66 children, primarily Native children, 3- and 4-year-olds. Last year, half of those children were identified as having a disability, 3- and 4-year-olds. And the majority of them were identified as having speech-language impairments. Now, and what we're also seeing in that program is an increasing number of challenging behaviors. So what we're working on in the study that we're doing with this Tribal Head Start program is trying to figure out, is there a connection between children's speech and language development, how competent they are, and their engagement in challenging behaviors. And I've asked the Head Start program to theorize about it. Why do you think these children with speech-language impairments are engaging in these challenging behaviors? And what they said is, well, if you can't express yourself well, then you act out because you want somebody to know what you want or how you're feeling. It didn't take $1 million to figure that out. But the next step is, once those children leave the Head Start program, where they're getting some pretty intensive speech-language services, they go into the public school, and the public school is saying, you've got to stop identifying so many children with speech and language because we don't have enough speech-language therapists and pathologists to provide services. My response to the tribe is tough for the school because, and that's easy for me to say because I'm not in that school every day, these children need these services. You're working efficiently with parents to get parents to understand that their child has an impairment or a delay. And if we can get early intervention services, then we can decrease potentially the number of Native children who go on to receive special ed services across their educational lifespan. And, I've asked that community Head Start director, aren't you concerned about this increasing number of children identified? And he said yes and no. Yes, because it does place a burden on our program and on the school system. He said, but I'm excited because what it's showing me is that our parents are getting more educated about the process. The stigma attached to their child having an impairment or a disability is lessening, and they want their children to get appropriate services, and they know we provide them. And we're excited about that. And we know that there's probably 10 times that number of children in our community who would receive services if we had the services to provide. So we're excited, but we're also scared because we know what happens when they go into the school system. Not just because the school system doesn't want to provide services, but because the school system doesn't have the services to provide. And so there's a real need to have more speech-language therapists, particularly native speech-language therapists, who understand patterns of dialect and just different kinds of things that go along with language. So that's the issues that we're seeing. We're also seeing in emotional and behavioral disabilities, as I told you, an increasing number. Tends to be an issue with males. The majority, and if you look in the 13 categories of disability, almost every one of those categories has more males than it does females. So you have to think about that. We also, autism is an increasing area of concern. I think now it's like 1 in every 125 children who's born is diagnosed as autistic. And so we have to figure out what's going on there. If you look at traumatic brain injuries, which is one of the other 13 categories, over a 10-year period of time, we saw about a 5,000% increase in the number of children diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. Shaken baby syndrome, extreme sports, motorbikes, shotgun accident, car accidents, child abuse. If you play football and you have repeated concussions that are not treated, can result in traumatic brain injuries. We're seeing all of these things going on. Part of the question is, are we seeing that much of an increase, or are we doing a better job of diagnosing? Yes. Mm-hmm. That was across the nation. Mm-hmm. And it was a 10-year period of time, I think, between 1990-something and the early 2000s. Every year, Congress puts out a report on the status of the implementation of IDEA, the special ed law, and there's tables, and you can see state-by-state tables, and it's online. And you can also see national data that tells you in the specific categories. There's also some data in there, by race and by ethnicity. So, but it's interesting to see what's happening in those individual categories. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that even though you've seen that 5,000% increase over that specific time period, traumatic brain injury is still one of the smallest categories of disability of any of those 13. The other category that's becoming interesting is the other health impairment category. It's kind of a catch-all. If you don't clearly fit into one of the other categories, you could be diagnosed as having other health impairment. Mm-hmm. Especially in those top 4, you're seeing, they're staying pretty stable, but you're seeing more and more in those categories. And then some of the other lower incidents, you're seeing smaller increases. Yeah. I think, there are categories of disability that are more subjective, and there are categories that are more objective. And I think in those subjective categories, we really need to look at issue of inappropriate identification and placement. Because, if you have a child who is mentally retarded, there are certain things that you can look at. You can look at IQ scores. You can look at a child's adaptive behavior, daily living skills, their ability to dress themselves, to feed themselves, to count money, to live independently. And you can measure those things. Learning disabilities, a little bit more subjective. It depends on how you view a learning disability. So, yeah, I think there's I don't want to say that people are being across the field or across the spectrum are being inappropriately assessed and identified, but there are a number of people who would say that we are doing some inappropriate assessment. Mm-hmm. More and more researchers are paying attention to it. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. No, it's not. And if you look at it, I mean, if you go back, special ed started in the 1973, I think, or in the late 1970s was the first time that we had any federal funding for special ed, and it was the first time that it was legally mandated. But if you go back and look at case law from the 70s on, there's been a series of legal cases that have challenged the appropriateness, particularly of standardized assessments as being used in identifying a child as having a disability, particularly African American, Hispanic students, Asian students. You haven't seen a lot of cases that have specifically dealt with Native students, but they can be included in those classes with the others. There are some states, I think California is one, where you cannot rely just on those standardized tests. The federal law says that now. You have to have multiple measures. But there have been a number of cases that have challenged. They've also challenged why is it that so many boys are in special ed? Why so many African American boys? So it's been a problem. And, you know, one of the issues is when I used to teach beginning special ed teachers, and what I asked them is, I said, I want you to think about the behaviors, and my language was a little worse than this, but what are those behaviors that really tick you off because in your classroom? Because those are the things that will cause you to refer a child to the principal's office and may result in that child being referred for special ed. I don't like for students to sleep in class. That really bothers me. But you can curse at me, there's a whole range of other things that I don't like, but I can tolerate it. Sleeping bothers the crap out of me. It's like, don't come to my class and sleep. There are other things, you know, people wearing a hat, chewing gum, you know, whatever it is. Those things that tick you off will cause you to refer a child. And so you really need to think about that. You also need to think, in response to intervention, I think it is good in some ways in that it says, let's try multiple interventions. And does the child's performance change? And it may be something as simple as, have you tried putting that child in a different teacher's classroom? Because maybe that teacher is setting that child off. And any of you teachers in the classroom, anybody ever seen a child that you just didn't like? There was something about that child that you just did not like. I've had it, and I didn't want to interact with that child. And I would rather anybody have that child than me. And so I talk to teachers about that. You need to be very cognizant of those things that will set you off. And you may not be the appropriate teacher for that student. It may be that I can't sit next to Marty because Marty just is going to give me the finger and do all kinds of stuff to aggravate me. So maybe I need to move away from Marty. So those kinds of things. Maybe I'm not understanding that Marty needs more one-on-one direction, or maybe Marty's the class leader. So let's look at things like that play up to Marty's potential rather than automatically saying Marty's a trouble child. So, you know, we can do those kinds of things and see how the child responds. Other issues, though, so we've talked about this disproportionate representation. And you can see that nationally we have about 12% of children, American Indian children in public schools are placed in special ed, and about 17% of those who are in Bureau of Indian Education, so the BIA, BIE schools, are in special ed. I'm always troubled by that because in my mind I would think that children in Bureau schools or tribal schools would be placed at a smaller rate than children in public schools because of those tribal and Bureau schools being more attuned to language and culture and having more Native teachers. And so it would serve as a protective factor, but the data is not showing us that. And now we need to figure that out. Why is that happening? Other issues, preparation and recruitment of special and general educators and related service providers. There needs to be more training, and especially now with No Child Left Behind and this mandate that more and more children be in the regular ed environment, you've got regular ed teachers and special ed teachers being forced to work together in the same environment. I say forced because you think about that. What if you were forced to marry somebody and you didn't want to marry them? How would that relationship look like? Because you have to navigate whose space is this, whose curriculum, whose child. So there needs to be training there. Parental rights and responsibilities. We need to do more in that area. And development and use of culturally and linguistically appropriate assessment. All of those things are issues and concerns. Education in the least restrictive environment. What does that mean? It means that just because a child has a disability doesn't mean they go in a special ed classroom. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 I mean, I think that's an important point, and I think, you need to be looking at assessment in multiple different environments, and, and also thinking, like you said, about language and culture as not just being an add-on, but how do we infuse that into the curriculum, across the curriculum, multiple different settings. And I think just looking about assessment in a different way, it's not just a pen and paper kind of thing. I told you, this Head Start study, and one of the things that we're doing is they've started using the Dial 3. So the Dial 3 is an assessment that you use in the early childhood. And in order to go in and work with this, Penn State said to me, we want to see the assessment because we have to see the instrument to approve it. And I said, well, I can't fax it to you because it's not a piece of paper. It's the child, and they were having a really hard time figuring out how they could see this when it's not a paper. And I said, the child goes in, they sit at stations, the assessor talks to them, they observe them doing real-life activities. That, to me, is what we need, is that kind of observation and assessment. And that goes, even though that's something that's used in many different settings, and people know it and they approve of it, that kind of thinking is not necessarily the norm, especially after you leave early childhood and you get into kindergarten, middle school, high school, that real-life, authentic kind of assessment. The other issues have to do with this education in the least restrictive environment, and I think an important piece is a lack of coordinated set of transition services. The law mandates transition at age 16. It used to be 14, so you want to have a transition plan in place that deals with what's going to happen when this child graduates or ages out of special ed. In the state of Michigan, you can receive special ed services to 25, I think it is. The federal law says the age of 21, so Michigan is going above and beyond the minimum set in the federal law. But what's going to happen to that child or that young adult when they're no longer eligible for school services? But the other piece that I've added in, and the law talks about this when you look at the transition into school, if you receive early intervention services from birth to age 2 or 3, it's very intensive, family-focused, in the home, in the child care setting. Families get services, the child gets services, all this stuff. Life is just great. Then the child goes to school, and no longer is that parent and that family the center of what the child is getting. It becomes, what does the child need? And so parents often don't understand, why is it that I'm not getting that same level of services that I got 6 months ago? So having a transition plan that helps prepare parents for this change in services, I think, is very important, but also helps the schools understand, what does this child's parent expect of the school? Having that conversation. I think also looking at what is a parent, that a parent is not necessarily a biological parent. It could be an aunt, an uncle, a family member. So getting the school system to understand in our communities what family looks like and what parent looks like and what's acceptable and who has the right to make decisions. I think another issue in Native communities has to do with our students often being transitory and going from one school setting to another school setting, one family setting to another. What happens with that transfer of records? And what happens to that child while the records are being transferred? That child still has the right to receive services. You don't get off as a school just because you say, I don't have records in place. If you knew that child had an IEP, then you have an obligation to provide services. If that child gets arrested and goes to prison or goes to the local county jail, the school has an obligation to transfer records to the legal system because that child still has the right to receive special ed in that jail setting. And if you look at it, there's a real correlation between the number of children who were identified as having emotional and behavioral disorders and the number who go on into the juvenile justice system or go on into the justice system afterwards. So we need to be thinking about that piece. Some of the risk factors, and I'm just going to rush through some of this because I want to give you time for questions or comments. And you can also see the rest in the presentation. We've done some work. I say we. I've worked with some other researchers at Penn State, and we've looked at a large national data set. It's called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study. And it has American Indian, Alaska Native students in that data set. It's a small number, but it's a large enough number for us to begin to look statistically at why our children are placed in special ed. And so what we looked at, and other researchers have looked too, just not with Native children, is we looked at social environmental factors. We looked at cognitive factors, so their academic ability as measured by standardized tests that schools use. We've used at behavior. And what I said here is behavioral engagement in or perception of. Because one of the important pieces when teachers are assessing children, there's often observations that are used. And if you observe a child, a lot of it has to do with what you perceive to be a challenging behavior or an inappropriate behavior. What if a child is allowed to act a certain way at home, and at school it goes against what you as a teacher allow? Your perceptions are different, and that is going to impact the way in which you assess that child. Again, it's not all on the teacher, but there is a lot because the teacher and the school level staff are so involved in this assessment process. And then there's other student level factors like their classroom learning behavior, their age, their gender, ethnicity. All of these factors should be looked at when trying to figure out why so many go into special ed. What we did in our analysis is that we know that if you come from a single-parent family, if you come from a minority family, African-American, American Indian, Hispanic, if you're male, we know that you're at risk of being found eligible for special ed. The literature tells you that. We didn't want to look so much at the SES piece, the social and the economic and the financial piece, because we know that places our children at risk. So we ran some numbers with that, but then we focused on the other thing, the academics and the behavior. And what we found is that in kindergarten, if you look at standardized scores, standardized achievement scores, in reading and math, then we could predict in kindergarten whether or not a Native child would be placed in special ed by grade 3. That goes back to what I said to you, and there's a lot of caveats because that's just one data set, one study. And we're very careful when we write about this to say one data set, one study. We're not answering all the questions. But this goes back to what I said earlier about if we wait until our children enter school, we've missed the mark because they're being placed at risk from the moment they enter school for the potential of being identified. When you start giving children these academic tests in reading and math, and you think about how many of those tests you have throughout the course of your education, what if our children don't do well with those tests? What if those tests measure something that those children aren't familiar with? So thinking about what those tests are doing and also thinking about other assessment instruments that you can use to make sure that it's more fair to our children. So I talked to you earlier about what are some of the consequences of this inappropriate identification. And these are the consequences that the state of Michigan has identified. And I thought that was important because, again, it validates some of what I've been saying, but it also gives us here, the state has looked and said, these are some of the things that can happen if you don't make sure that a child gets appropriate services. In terms of education, the state says that it can result in limited access to the general ed curriculum. It can result in lowered expectations, low graduation rates, high dropout rates. If any of you are interested in graduation and dropout rates, and I've been dabbling a little bit with that, at Johns Hopkins University, and this is not in the presentation, there is a man there named Bob Balfanz. It's B-A-L-F-A-N-Z, Balfanz. And he's done some work with schools across the nation where he has graduation rates, because if you look at dropout rates and graduation rates really are the more accurate figure rather than dropout rates. He has a website where you can go in and you can click on the whole state of Michigan and look at school districts and find out where the dropout factories are. So where are those schools in our state that are producing the highest number of dropouts or students not graduating? And it's interesting if you go there and just look, because you're familiar with these schools, to see what's happening in the schools where our Native children are, whether they're there in high numbers or low numbers, and look from your own knowledge, what do those communities look like? What's the teacher population look like? What's the student population look like? I think it's very instructive of what's going on and some of the factors that are affecting our children. Poor academic outcomes, behavioral problems, resulting in suspension and expulsion. I want to go back to low graduation rates and high dropout rates. There was one study that looked at American Indian students, and what it found is that, it was like it looked at American Indian males age 14 and over who had received special ed services. I think it was about 50% of those did not graduate or dropped out. And then of those who stayed in, it was about 33% who actually graduated. So you've got about 50% just dropping out or not being there, and about 33% of those who stayed in graduating. And it's kind of confusing. You have to look at the whole study. But the point of that is something's happening to our children, and they're not all graduating or they're not all completing. And it's not just the ones in special ed, but it's particularly, I think, alarming when you look at children who receive special ed, what's happening to those children. In terms of economic outcomes, there's a decreased potential to attend college. Because you think about it, if a child has a learning disability, that does not mean that child cannot attend college. If you look at college students, I would venture to say there are many, many who have learning disabilities, but they've learned strategies. You have some of these other disabilities, mental retardation, some of the more severe disabilities, that's not necessarily a track towards college, because you think about the classes that are attached to that label, the kind of preparation that you get. Involvement in the juvenile justice system, particularly when you look at emotional and behavioral disorders, high unemployment rates, lowered socioeconomic status, and lack of health care. Now, again, this is a pretty depressing kind of conversation, but I want to go back and say these are the things that happen when a child is misplaced or misidentified. They either don't get the services they need, they should be in gifted and they end up in special ed, or they end up in the regular classroom and they don't get special ed. This is what can happen. So I'm not in any way saying special ed is causing all of this. What I'm saying is misappropriate identification. The child's not getting the services that he or she needs. This is what can happen. So the issue there is not to go back and say we don't need special ed. And I'd be the last person to argue against special ed. I think it's one of the greatest things that's ever happened to the educational system, because before the enactment of special ed law, our children were being summarily just dismissed from school and not getting services. But what I am saying is, if our services are not provided in a manner that's culturally and linguistically appropriate, academically appropriate, there's a potential for some really negative outcomes. And just a couple of strategies that I'll go over to reduce inappropriate placement. These are not my strategies. You'll see a reference on the bottom of the slide. One is to promote family involvement and respect diverse backgrounds. I've worked with a program. It's now, I don't work with the program anymore, but we had a program where we went across the country and we worked with parents and families. And what we would do is we would do training about the special ed process, but we would also train community members who understood. They had, what I like to say is they had just enough knowledge about special ed to be dangerous. But what they would do is, if you went to a special ed meeting, an IEP meeting or some other kind of meeting, and say your partner or your husband or your wife couldn't go, and you needed somebody there for support, you had this person in the community who understood the special ed process and could go with you to say, you need to calm down. We need to take a break. Have you thought about this question? They're not a lawyer, they're not a legal advocate, but somebody who's there as your support system. And that can be done in a variety of ways. It can be a community member, somebody, I keep going back to Title VII or Indian Ed, can play a really active role in that and being a part of the IEP meeting. But there needs to be some way to promote this involvement. And one of the other things that we did at this training is we would talk about in the IEP meeting, if you have a child and the child's disability is too severe or the child is too young to go to the IEP meeting, bring a picture of the child and place that picture on the table. And I think about it when I come from a family that likes to gossip, and so my mom can tell me all the gossip in the neighborhood, and so I like to call her every day and ask her what's going on. And so when you're talking about people behind their back, it becomes really easy to say all kinds of things and to do things. When that person enters the room, your conversation changes. And so having that child physically present or having their picture there changes the conversation in a way that it makes you understand every decision we make today impacts this child, this beautiful little one. It's not just an IEP. It's not just a form. It impacts this child. We also talk to parents and families about bringing food. You know, Indian people like to eat. You bring food to the meeting. The family does. You place it on the table. You don't bring a whole feast, but you bring cookies or candy or something. If people don't eat your food, you know you're in trouble. You know, so you set the stage. You as the parent and the family say, this is not your meeting. This is our meeting. We're coming to talk about our child. And it's simple things like that that change the dynamics. Build on this, make the curriculum relevant. So, you know, you want to make sure what's happening in the curriculum. Is the child interested in it? Does it relate to the child? Build on the student's strengths. You know, I think about it when I edit students' papers, and I'm a pretty picky editor. I always start out by saying, this student or this writer should be commended for writing about something really, really exciting. But, or however, it can be strengthened in a number of ways. So for every child, there's a strength. It doesn't matter how bad that child appears. Every child has a strength. And IEPs identify not just a child's weaknesses or areas of need, they identify a child's strengths. And I think that's very important. Develop and deliver teacher prep programs in the communities in which teachers will be working. There is a program, I'm not sure if it's still operating now at Northern Arizona University. It was called RAISE, and it was Reaching American Indian Special Educators. So they brought in teacher assistants, and they had them in that area. They'd get their degrees with the caveat that they would stay in that community and teach or work. You could do things like that. The Office of Indian Ed has grants for personnel development. Northern Michigan could write a grant if it got funded. Train teachers, native teachers from Northern Michigan to stay in the community. We do it at Penn State with educational administrators. We have a master's degree program in educational leadership. For every year that you get your degree, you have to go back and work in a native school or community or pay the money back. So if you aren't intrinsically motivated to work in that community, you're financially motivated. You know, so things like that can work. And then providing support to district staff as they learn to work more effectively with students from diverse backgrounds. You know, thinking about it, that every teacher is not a teacher with a 4-year degree or a master's degree, that we have indigenous knowledges in our communities, we have elders, we have people who can come in and work with our teachers in our schools to help them understand how you can work more effectively with our students. Those are just 5 strategies that have been recognized as working effectively. There's a whole list of other things in the presentation that I won't get to, but I will scroll to the end. There's some resources with American Indian Higher Ed Consortium. There's the Head Start Program Research Center at Colorado. The University of Minnesota has a really good program where they work with community integration. They have a program, it's circles, and I can't remember the last part of it, but they actually work with integrating Native children who graduated from school or who finished school back into the community. So these are children who've had a disability, looking at that transition piece. So there are a few places that are doing some of this work and that we can learn from. So I will stop there, and we have about 5 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? Have I totally confused or bored everybody? No questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. You know, I think one of the issues, if I can get this to show that I'll say it. I worked with or met a family in North Carolina where there were 5 children in that family from kindergarten through high school. And every child in that family was in special ed, so from early intervention services all the way up to high school. And when I talked with the parents, both the parents were in special ed. And I asked them about that. I said, you know, why were you in special ed? And they they weren't quite sure. They just knew that they had received special ed services. And I asked them, I said, what are your children receiving services for? And they said, we're not sure. So part of it, I really can't answer your question, is it biological? I think if you look in things like attention deficit and ADHD, there are some biological connections that if one parent or one sibling is identified as having ADD or ADHD, then there's a tendency for another sibling or a child to be identified. Autism, sometimes you might see siblings having it, things like dyslexia. So there are some biological connections, but there's also looking at environmental pieces, but then also going back to the assessment process. So I think it can't be limited just to one factor, but there's a whole host of things. If you look at fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol effect, there's some people who are arguing that you're seeing that manifest itself with mental retardation, learning disabilities, other kinds of things. Yes.
I think the language component that you talked about is huge, because when I had the privilege of teaching on Vercloth in Alaska, I was administering their state exit to for the seniors. And one of the boys who was a whaling captain's son, very, very well competent, had trouble passing the exam 2 years in a row. We got to a question, he raised his hand, and as the ELL teacher, I came over and said, teacher, what's a lawn? L-A-W-N. I said, well, sweetie, it's grass that we buy in the lower 48, we plant it around the house, we mow it, and all that. Looked at me, really, but I called the state, and I said, just out of curiosity, how many rural Alaskan students missed that question? And it was in the 90th percentile range, and would change the test. And that was huge. Very simple vocabulary word, and he had been a child that was almost referred for special ed because he was a UPS language speaker.
And I think that that's a critical piece. I mean, you also think about our children who are in a family where a native language is being spoken and English is being spoken, but the child is not proficient in either. And then they go to school and they're assessed in English, and they look like a child with a speech-language impairment, but maybe it's the assessor who has the impairment because the child is being assessed in a language that they're not competent in. But in effect, that child's kind of gifted because they can manage pieces of both languages. Yes. Right. You know, and I think that's important. One of the things that I say to my students at Penn State when I teach, I always start out by saying, you know, if you can't tell by my accent, I'm not from Pennsylvania. And, you know, I go through the whole thing. And then I'll ask them later, why do you think I told you that? And I say that particularly when we're talking about speech and language impairments, because what I say to them is, I don't have a speech-language impairment, but I do have a linguistic difference, and that it impacts the way in which I communicate, the way in which I think, the way in which I process things. And there's a part of me, I mean, I struggle with, I should sound more northern. I've been in the north for how many years? But that's a part of what identifies who I am and defines who I am. And so, you know, you struggle with those kinds of things. I lived in Los Angeles last year, and every street corner there was a sign that says, call us and we'll fix your accent. You know, and so there's, I'm like, okay, they're after me. I need to go. But, you know, you think about it, there's something that is associated with if you speak differently, then there must be something that needs to be fixed. And I had that conversation with some Head Start people in another state where they were saying, well, the children are getting ready to leave Head Start, and it was a tribal Head Start program, and going to the public school. And they told the parents, you need to start getting your children to speak like they speak in the school and not like we speak at home. And I said, you need to stop telling them that, because it's sending the message that there's something wrong. Now, there is a standard English in a way that's going to be graded and assessed, but those children need to understand, and the families need to understand, that's a part of who you are. And, you know, we become code shifters in a way that we understand this is how we speak in this setting, but that doesn't lessen the importance of how we speak in home, or different words that we use, or phrases, or ways that we say things. But any last points? Yes.
It's interesting. I went to a response
Mm-hmm.
She looked more like they did than the white did.
Right.
And she had more conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So they had sheltered instruction for the Spanish-speaking kids in school, and of course everything else was in English. Nothing in Lakota, but they didn't recognize that a lot of what she was learning on the playground, she was trying to infuse in the classroom.
Right.
And so it was very interesting, the disparity, the approach to linguistics or what they prepared for.
Right. 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 I mean, there's so many interesting things going on, and I think that's why it's important to have, Native educators, Native parents, and communities working together with other educators and other researchers, because I think we can see things from these other perspectives about what's going on and explaining things. The last picture, and I'll just end here, I like to show, this is my niece Kanani again, and so she just turned 3 in April. And her birthday party, she had Spider-Man and Dora. She had a Dora piñata. So, but I showed this picture to say, it's kind of her. There's one picture that's not on there, and it's a picture of her at 3. She already has her frequent flyer card because she's coming back from Hawaii so much to see my parents. And there's a picture of her, and I asked people, what do you think this picture means? And so the picture is a picture of her with her little roller bag, and she's actually going to the airport. But I use it to demonstrate that's what's happening with many of our children in the school system, is that they're leaving. They're being forced out. They're being pushed out. And I think our challenge is to think about ways in which we keep our children there, and we keep them there in ways that are positive and that affirm our children. And so I like to use this image because it's kind of her, like she's the Spider-Man, Superman saying, stop the madness and keep our children in school, because I really do think if we go back to these beautiful little ones, that they have so much to teach us about what we need to be doing to pay attention to what their strengths are, as well as areas in which they need work or they need assistance. But it's really paying attention to what they're telling us. And I'll give the last example. She's in a daycare program in Hawaii, and my sister called me and she said Kanani has this new friend, and she said she's a special needs child. And I'm trying to work with them on person first language. It's not a special needs child, but it's a child with a special need or a child with a disability. Just saying you really need to put the child first. But I didn't fight that battle with her. And I said, well, what's wrong? And she said, well, she asked Kanani, the little girl wears a patch on her eye. And she asked her, Kanani, why does Sky wear this patch on her eye? And Kanani is 3, and she said, Mom, Sky has a boo-boo, that's why. And so at 3, she was able to explain what was going on. And it wasn't this thing that set Sky apart from her. It's just a boo-boo. And I think, we think about having our children in these least restrictive environments where other children understand and relate to them rather than having them in separate environments where they're separated and they become special because there's something wrong with them. And I think about that having been in a special ed classroom where my children, I would talk to them because they would put labels on people coming by in the hallway. And I would say to them, don't you understand what people are saying about you when they see you in this classroom? And so we'd have to talk about those perceptions of themselves as well as perceptions of other people. And I think that's what we need to be really careful about in the special ed process, is that the child doesn't become the label. That, there's something more than that child having a learning disability or being mentally retarded. That's just a part of who that child is. I teach a diversity class now, and I ask my children, or my students, these are graduate students, I said, what does knowing a child's race or ethnicity, or their disability status, their gender, their sexual orientation, what does that tell you about how to teach that child? If it doesn't teach you anything, then it's not that important. So really understanding what does that label tell us and how we need to best work with that child. How do we individualize their instruction? And again, I think that's our challenge, is figuring out, is that label appropriate for that child's current level of need as well as their ability? So I'll stop there. I do have on the handout my address, my email address, if anybody has questions, if you want a copy of the presentation, or if you have questions about something else that was presented. So thank you all.